Jen, may I begin?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tova Train, National President of CHW, and I am joining you from the tundra that is Toronto. Welcome to today's webinar, Recipes of Resistance, the Ravensbrück Recipe Book. This workshop will explore the remarkable story of Rebecca Teitelbaum's secret recipe book, created in the concentration camp during the Holocaust. Allow me to introduce our guests. Lisa Kirschner is the Director of Education at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. There, she leads the center's resource and curriculum development, school programs, and teacher training initiatives. She has worked with the center for over 2 decades. Ellie Lawson is responsible for the development, advancement, and support of educational incentives at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. She develops resources and delivers impactful programs for schools, educators, and professionals, the public and adult learners. Ellie has collaborated closely with Holocaust survivors, as well as second and third generation descendants and survivors of human rights violations, amplifying their narratives. Just a note, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please put them in the Q&A box, and Lisa Colt-Kotler will manage the questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, ladies. I hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to the webinar, everyone. We're joining you from rainy Vancouver. There's no tundra here, no sign of snow except on the mountain. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit, for those of you who are not familiar with us, the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center is 31 years old. We were founded by survivors of the Holocaust here in Vancouver, led by a group of tenacious child survivors who in the 1980s and 1990s began a remarkable education program that we are continuing today. In addition to collecting their testimonies and producing educational materials, they also began a collection of archival materials and artifacts, and our collection now stands at approximately 10,000 items. What we are going to do today is bring to you one of those items, one of the most beloved actually in our collection, which is the recipe book of Rebecca Buckman Teitelbaum. Rebecca was the only mother that Vancouver Holocaust survivor Alex Buckman ever knew. Alex was an incredible educator here with our center. He died in 2023, and he is very much missed, but his story certainly lives on through this recipe book and that of his mother, his aunt, really, Rebecca Teitelbaum, who raised him as her own after the Holocaust. In the 1990s, Alex discovered Rebecca's recipe book, and he learned from her the incredible story of its origins and its survival. In 1999, Alex donated the recipe book to the VHEC, and here it has been now the subject of much interest and study by museum attendees, by school children, and researchers alike. So today we're really very pleased to share the personal backstory and the broad historical context in which this remarkable artifact emerged. So this is Rebecca Teitelbaum. She was born in Antwerp, Belgium in 1909. Her maiden name was Buckman, and the Buckman family was small by the descriptions of the time. She only had 2 brothers, Isaac and Jacques. And here on the right, we see Rebecca with her brother, Isaac. Rebecca met and married her husband, Herman, in Brussels in 1938. This is a picture of them here, and very soon after, about a year after, they had a daughter, Annie. They lived in Anderlecht, which is near Brussels, and before the Second World War, Rebecca worked in the accounting department of a famous department store in Brussels. Now, meanwhile, the couple, her brother, Isaac, who was Alex's father, he met his wife, Devorah, and they lived also in the same city in Brussels, and he was the manufacturer of leather briefcases, while Devorah sold women's corsets at home. And later that same year, they had a son, Alex, and the family really only had 2 years together, both families actually. So this is going to be the story of two couples. May of 1940, Germany invaded Belgium. This was when Rebecca and Isaac's children were less than a year old. So Annie and Alex were still toddlers, not even toddlers, still babies in diapers when the Nazis invaded Belgium. Just 18 days after the invasion, Belgium surrendered and Nazi Germany occupied the country. The Nazis established an occupation government in June of 1940. But importantly, the Belgian civil servants remained in place and they continued to administer the daily affairs of the government under German supervision. This structure is important because later on, when the deportations were ordered, the deportations of the Jews, the Belgian civil administration refused to cooperate. And so, because of this refusal, unlike other Western European governments, their refusal to go along with the Nazis' orders did make a difference to the survival rate of many of the Jews of Belgium. In October of 1940, the first anti-Jewish Belgian laws were enacted. And the result of this was to remove Jewish civil servants from their jobs, to isolate economically and socially the Jewish population of Belgium. And Belgium itself was overwhelmingly Catholic. And Jews made up a very small portion of the population, about 0.1%. Nevertheless, Jewish businesses were discriminated against, required to hold or to post these signs in their window identifying them as Jewish businesses. There were the requirements to register Jewish families, to carry identity cards marked with the stamp Jud or Juif. This is Rebecca's identity papers that we see here in larger format. So she was required to carry this along with her husband and her brother and sister. Possession of this ID, of course, was compulsory and was effective in isolating the Jewish citizens of Belgium. On Easter Monday in April of 1941, there was a riot in Antwerp, a massive pogrom that was carried out led by the Nazis, but in which some Belgian citizens participated. During this time, it was clear to both couples, both Rebecca and Isaac and their partners, that their children were no longer safe. And they decided in 1941 to place their children into hiding with private individuals who agreed to hide their children in exchange for money. This was not organized by the Belgian resistance. So the children were not incredibly safe. It was better than being with their parents, but eventually the money ran out to pay for these families to take care of their children. And the woman that had hidden Alex denounced both couples to the Gestapo. And that put the families in grave danger. In 1942, Jews were required to wear the yellow star if they were over the age of 6. And then by August of 1942, the roundups began. Now, having been denounced by the woman that was originally hiding Alex, the couples became very, very concerned for their children. And they eventually made the difficult decision to permanently separate from their children. They put their children into hiding with this organization, the Committee for the Defense of Jews. This was a picture here on the left of André Guillon, who was a Belgian school teacher, and she is credited with saving the lives of hundreds of children. She worked for, as I said, the Committee for the Defense of Jews, which in total rescued about 3,000 Belgian children. And they did so by having a broad organization of hiding places in convents and schools and private homes. And they kept extensive notes of the children. In these books, this booklet here, you can see Annie and Alex's names, their entries, and their code numbers. There were about a series of 7 or 8 different books over which information about the children were kept in secret. So this was the separation of the family began in 1943 and continued for the next several years. Meanwhile, almost immediately after the children went into hiding with the resistance, the deportations of the couples occurred. And we can see here on these deportation lists, both Annie's parents and Alex's parents are listed and were rounded up and deported in August of 1943. So Devorah and Isaac, Alex's parents, they were sent to Auschwitz in 1943 and murdered very soon after their arrival. Rebecca and her husband were not sent to Auschwitz. Rebecca was sent to Ravensbrück and Herman to Buchenwald. And Rebecca spent 17 months in Ravensbrück. She worked, originally she was assigned as a slave laborer to hard labor for about 4 months, hauling wood and stone in heavy carts in harsh outdoor conditions. But because she had worked in a department store in Belgium and had experience with accounting work, she was eventually able to secure a better assignment in the office of the Siemens factory. And Ellie's going to speak more about this. But what you'll learn is that the better working conditions for those women who were lucky enough to secure a position in the factory office certainly contributed to Rebecca's survival. So I'm going to turn the stage over to Ellie, who will talk a little bit more about Ravensbrück.
All right. So Ravensbrück was established in 1939. The Nazi administration was seeking a women's only camp. It was established in the spring, so before World War II broke out in later in September. And so most of the prisoners in the camp were asocial political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, mostly German women considered enemies of the state. As the Nazis broke broke the world into World War II. The war expanded the population of those imprisoned in the camp. And so not only did you see over 30 different nationalities then become prisoners of the camp, but you also see an exponential increase of Jews and Roma in the camp as well. The camp was originally built for over about 1,000 prisoners, but at its peak, there were over 50,000 prisoners held at once, and that was by 1945. 20% of those prisoners, total prisoners, were Jews. The images on the screen are just two visual representations of what camp life looked like for prisoners, women in Ravensbrück. Prisoners were forced to work in different professions or different tasks, textiles, mechanical, construction, and testing. Administration, sex work, typing, more administration, weaving factories, and other industries. Each year, it seemed as though from testimony, the experience of women got worse and worse. Mostly female guards were stationed at Ravensbrück, and it was actually a training site for other SS women's guards who would then be sent to other concentration camps. Medical experiments were conducted on prisoners at the time, and what you see, the photo on the right, is a clandestine photo taken at the height of the Holocaust, in which a woman you see is pulling up her skirt or her pant leg to show you the consequences, the after effects of a medical experiment done on her by Nazi doctors, physicians, and nurses. The clandestine photo was a way of resisting. It was smuggled in by prisoners that were coming from Poland, and so that's a nice little story that you can look up later, but we don't have time for. Um, Once again, the situation in Ravensbrück uh, was terrorizing, was filled with fear and death for many of the prisoners. According to Alex's testimony, Rebecca, like Lee's mentioned too, first worked in forced labor and hard labor moving wood, but the Siemens factory actually opened or was being built, and prisoners heard that they were looking for some to be transferred to that factory. Siemens Halske, which is the company that is still established today, was originally a telegraph construction company, but moved towards electrical engineering and technology. Siemens was actually one of the first companies to cooperate with the Nazis for armament productions, specifically using prisoners in the concentration camps. So, with many German men going to the war fronts during World War II, German industry struggled with labor shortages. And so, to keep the war machine running, the German economy healthy, companies like Siemens turned to forced labor. And so, what you can see on the map is the blueprints for the Siemens factory being built in conjunction with the already established Ravensbrück. The construction started in 1942 and was opened that year as well. Prisoners had to walk to the main camp of the Siemens camp by early 1945. These prisoners walked by the newly constructed gas chambers. The Ravensbrück camp is up by the purple pin on the map. This is just a modern day Google Map screenshot. And then you can actually see the red dot is the ruins of the Siemens factory. As Siemens was established, the number of prisoners and jobs exponentially increased. So the factory's main aim was to contribute to the war production. So that was through electrical and armament materials. And in fact, the company increased its profits through the 1940s and set them up after World War II to be I guess, a healthy and thriving economic business, despite an economy being so devastated by the war. Rebecca worked in the administration department. We've listed some of the other jobs that prisoners had, including creating voltmeters, organizing and building parts for V2 rockets and ship materials. There were some women that had artistic skills, so they were actually creating production graphics for Siemens and Nazi officials as well. So while the conditions were relatively understood to be better at the Siemens factory compared to other jobs at Ravensbrück, prisoners still experienced hunger, unsanitary conditions, and terror from guards and supervisors. And so, despite those inhumane and degrading conditions, women still banded together to resist and even sabotage production. This is a quote from an Italian prisoner, Lydia, and illuminates how and what ways sabotage took place. Not only for us to understand, but how she, in her memory, understood what they were doing to continue to survive. So I would just like to read the bottom two paragraphs, but at the top, she's just mentioning that there was unintentional sabotage where maybe in a state of exhaustion or delusion, you switched up mechanical wiring. But there was more deliberate acts. Those are more conscious acts. And so the end of the quote goes, even the theft of a piece of wire, a sheet of paper, or of a cloth was even seen as sabotage, but everybody committed to that. Any form of friendship between inmates was also seen as sabotage. Aiding our fellow inmates in their survival and at the cost of smooth running of production was seen by the system as the most profound sabotage. And so with that, I want to now we want to now turn back to Rebecca's story. And first we're going to listen to Alex, her nephew, describe Rebecca's acts of resistance and survival at Ravensbrück.
One day when she was working different shifts, sometimes during the day, in the afternoon, in the evening. And when she saw a roll of brown paper. And then she had an idea in her head, and it was a dangerous idea, but she was determined. And at night she saw that there weren't that many supervisors. And then she stole a piece of brown paper and she put it in her dress. And then she stole a little pencil and a pair of scissors. And at night she ran towards her barack, very nervous because she knew that if somebody would stop her with all these stolen goods, she would be in trouble. And they probably would make an example of her, maybe either shoot her or hang her. But she did it. And she came into a barack, and on the side were the bunk beds, 3 floors up, very large ones. About 10 or 12 women would be able to sleep on each level. And then there was nothing in the middle of her barack, and she sat on the floor, and she took this piece of paper that she had. It was a large piece of paper, and she started to cut little pieces not bigger than this. And then she started to write. And the women in her barack wanted to know what she was writing, and she just continued about 10, 12 pieces. So what did she write? She wrote recipes of food, of meals that she did for her husband and her daughter when before the war. And she started to read them to the other women, and they all thought of home, and they all started to cry together. With the help of other women who gave her some of their own recipes, and many of hers, she wrote 110 recipes. And even though food was very important to stay alive in the concentration camp, she actually traded some of her food for needles and thread. And she made a book so she could keep it. But she was afraid that people would steal it, and or not only steal it for themselves, but also steal it so that they could give it to the people in charge of the barack, so that they would get an extra ration of food.
So with the historical context that Ellie's given you, I hope you can now see how incredibly dangerous and brave Rebecca's actions were in doing what she did. Women in the camp reported that their daily conversations and their dreams at night were usually about food. The constant debilitating hunger that they experienced produced an obsession with food, not obviously just in this camp, but across the survivor experience overall. Survivors talk about talking recipes for hours and hours until they could almost see the food and taste it. Sometimes they would have a reaction where, producing saliva in their mouth because they were describing food to each other. And it's in this environment, and most particularly at Ravensbrück, that this resulted in attempts by women to record these fantasy recipes, to create a permanent record of this food talk as an act of resistance against the Nazis' attempt to obliterate not just them, but Jewish culture. So this recipe book that we're looking at here, you can see it's written in French, which was Rebecca's native language. It's not a traditional recipe book. It's not compiled as an instructional manual in the way a conventional cookbook would be, but rather the recipe book serves as a witness to the starvation and the extreme deprivation that the women in Ravensbrück were subjected to. And it's also an example of the unique gendered response, the gendered survival strategies that women developed using their domestic expertise and their domestic knowledge to provide comfort to each other, to forge a sense of community among women from various parts of Europe and various backgrounds, and also to sustain hope. Rebecca admitted to Alex years later that many of the recipes were extravagant and that the ingredients were exaggerated. They're often, as you flip through them, and we have on our website, on our collections website, you can see both the original recipes in the French handwritten, beautiful handwritten script of Rebecca, but also a translation in English. And you'll see that they are frequently heavy on butter and sugar and luxury items like raisins and rum and cream. Some of the recipes, a few, reflect kind of wartime rationing. Recipes use leftover bread or stale toast, for example. But some of them have also stretching ingredients like stuffed rice or semolina, that kind of thing. But most of them, the dominant theme is recipes of celebration, recipes of abundance. So you see many cakes and soufflés and pastries and torts that use chocolate and eggs and kirsch and rum and almonds and jam. I mean, it's just, even today, going through these recipes, one salivates. The other thing that's interesting about the recipes in the book is that they reflect a cultural diversity that I think, so some of the recipes are, traditionally Jewish recipes. Some are Belgian, some are French. There's ones with Mediterranean influences, Spanish recipes that I think reflect the fact that women in Ravensbrück came from all over Europe and were sharing their family stories and their family traditions with each other. And Rebecca was writing these down as they engaged in this really communal act of comfort and sharing. The irony is Alex mentioned himself that as a starving woman, Rebecca actually traded her precious food rations in order to get a needle and thread to allow her to bind this book, these pages together to create a permanent object. And when you see it in person, the recipe book can be held in your hand. It's very small. So it's no larger than the size of the palm of my hand, but it is an object that gives permanence to the existence of these women. It's an act of defiance and resistance against the Nazis and their attempt to obliterate these women. During Rebecca's imprisonment, which lasted about 17 months, she was able to correspond by letter to her brothers, to Herman and her brother Jacques. So these are some of the surviving letters that are in our collection. And when we read them, they really give us a glimpse into Rebecca's thoughts as she was compiling her recipe book. Now, the letters are heavily censored, but nonetheless, we can read a little bit of the personal reflections and private conversations between Rebecca and her husband. This letter from her husband Herman says, "My beloved Becky, thank God I am healthy, and I wish you all the best too. I thank you. I have received your letter from October, and I am really happy about it. I have not got news from your brother for a long time. Altogether, I have received 2 packages from him." Then he says, "The lovely dream that you have told me about is our common wish, and it will be also with our beloved Annie," that's their daughter, "with our beloved Annie when we are all together. In October, when we have not written, but we have in August and September, may our hope to see each other soon come true. Hugs and kisses, your beloved spouse, Herman. So clearly in the correspondence back and forth between them, they are talking about their dreams to be reunited, to be at home with their daughter. And it's in this context that Rebecca is writing these recipes. When she completed the recipe book, she went on to produce 2 more recipe books, which she gave as gifts to other women in the camp. And this is also something quite common. It's another uniquely gendered response of women facing persecution under the Nazis. And that is gift giving, caring for one another, showing affection by creating and gifting objects. And having personal possessions like a recipe book was something really treasured. It was unusual and unique and very precious. So she, in addition to the 2 recipe books she gave away, she then created a volume of poems and resistance songs, which you see on the display here. And she made 2 sets of playing cards, which the Roma women in the camp would use to tell fortunes for the other women. So I think we're able to paint kind of a picture of the way these women created a community among them as a way to stave off boredom and fear and desperation and dehumanization, frankly. As the Allies finally approached Germany in March of 1945, the Nazis gave orders to evacuate Ravensbrück. And as Ellie said, at the end of the war, by 1945, there were about 50,000 prisoners at Ravensbrück. And the orders from the Nazis were to send about half of those prisoners on a death march to Mecklenburg. Now, at the same time, in March, April of 1945, the Red Cross was undertaking a mission from Sweden to send buses. It became known as the White Buses. It was a convoy that was sent in end of April of 1945. It traveled at nighttime and brought about 2,000 women from Ravensbrück back to Denmark and Sweden, rescued them. Rebecca was among one of these 2,000 women from Ravensbrück who was selected for this rescue mission. And so she was on one of these white buses here and was traveling. It was still a Nazi-occupied war zone that they were traveling through. And in fact, her bus was hit by friendly fire from Allied aircraft on April 25th. And she survived this attack. Again, friendly fire was a mistaken attack. They didn't realize they were hitting Red Cross buses. And there were about 25 fatalities, but she survived. Her arm was badly injured by shrapnel. And so the possessions that she had with her on the bus were lost in the chaos, but she ended up in a hospital in Denmark. And here we see the telegram that was sent from this hospital in Denmark to her husband, Herman, who had been liberated from Buchenwald and was now back in Brussels. And this telegram, which is dated June 19, 1945, advises him that his wife, Rebecca, is in hospital in Denmark. During her stay in hospital, which lasted a couple of months, it took quite a while for her to recuperate her health after starvation in Ravensbrück and the injury due to the shrapnel. She was visited by King Christian X of Denmark. That becomes significant later in the story. And this is the telegram that Rebecca was able to send back to her family, that she received in return, telling her that not only had her husband Herman survived, but her brother Jacques and her daughter Annie. The story, of course, is not all happy because her brother Isaac, Alex's father, and his wife Devorah did not ever return. They had been murdered in Auschwitz. Following the war, the family was reunited. And Rebecca had a son whom she named Christian after King Christian of Denmark. Annie and Alex, you can see them on horseback. Rebecca had made a promise to her brother that she would care for Alex if anything happened to him. And so she adopted Alex both with her heart and through legal means as her son and raised him. The family in 1951 decided to leave Europe they immigrated to Montreal. We can see their landing cards. They came through Pier 21, and they settled in Montreal in 1953. And many, many years later, the story of the recipe book came to light. It was not until the 1990s that I think anybody other than Rebecca learned the story. Rebecca's sack, which had contained the recipe book and the letters that we saw and the other book of poems, they actually were found by somebody in the ravine near the site of the bombing when she was on the white bus. And so these were returned to her about 2 years after the bombing. Her name was on the letters, and it allowed her to be traced. And the person that found them arrived at her home one day, knocked on the door, and returned this package to her. And then she subsequently shared it, gave it to Alex, and Alex decided to donate it to our museum, where it is now the center of many education programs that we run here today. The recipe book, our recipe book, is one of 6 recipe books preserved in museum archives around the world. These are created in different concentration camps. I think 3 of them are in Ravensbrück, and one in Theresienstadt, and one at another. I'm trying to remember where the third, Lippstadt, that's right. And curators and historians study these carefully. They call them fantasy cookbooks because the ingredients were unavailable, the recipes were fanciful, and they were really about maintaining identity and resisting dehumanization and transmitting a culture that the Nazis were trying to destroy. They also served a functional purpose, a psychological coping mechanism that forged group cohesion and a spirit of communal care. Historians stress that these are not cookbooks in the normal sense of the word. They really are more like a form of testimony that serve as a witness to the conditions endured by female prisoners in concentration camps. And they also emphasize the great risk and the sacrifice that came from creating and possessing these, maintaining these recipe books. They demonstrate not only the agency of female prisoners asserting control over their hunger by eating with words, but they also provide an archive of women's communal responses to their persecution. And they really elevate women's domestic expertise to the level of historical record. This is a picture of Alex Buckman in one of his favorite places, one of the places where he really shone, in a school library with a group of elementary school children who are just captivated by the story of the recipe book. He always shared the recipe, his favorite recipe from the book for orange cake. This was a cake that Rebecca would make for him every birthday and every family celebration. And he would ask the students to take the recipe, make it with their families at home, remember his aunt, and remember the victims and the survivors of the Holocaust. And this coming week, I know a group of university students in several cities across the country are remembering Rebecca and Alex and this story by making this orange cake. So we're sharing it here on the screen for you and invite you to make it at home with your families.
Lisa and Ellie,
Yeah.
I'm assuming you've reached the end of your presentation.
We have,
Yeah,
yes.
Well, okay, I'm drooling with the image on the screen, so thanks for making that the end of your presentation. Lunch is can't come fast enough for me now. I really want to thank the two of you for a truly interesting presentation and an inspiring story about a very strong woman who, against all odds, managed to, try to keep her own sanity and the sanity of those around her. And like you said, try to maintain some sense of humanity, in such harsh conditions and, really dehumanizing conditions. So, um, always difficult to learn of Holocaust stories and stories of survival because you begin to imagine how you would cope during such difficult and challenging circumstances. But this one really personally I could relate to because I'm a foodie and I love cooking and I love coming up with recipes. And, I don't know if I would have the courage or the strength to trade food for needle and thread,
Yeah.
to stitch my recipe book together. That took tremendous courage and bravery, and the whole thing did. And I'm always hungry, so I would certainly have not have traded anything for food. But despite that, to have that fortitude is really remarkable, and it goes to show you the inner strength that she had. Um, we have a few questions, and I wanted to share that um, one of the things that I was wondering about is, how do you think um, these recipes specifically became such a powerful medium for memory and hope? Like, what do you think inspired her to start this and for the other women to come forward? Because they knew they couldn't make these recipes, and they knew, and all they were doing were, when you look at pictures of food, it makes you hungry, right? So it was only adding. It was almost like it was self-defeating in a way, but yet they gathered around this and clung to it as a piece of hope. Why do you think that is?
Um, well, it's a great question. Oftentimes, I mean, my first thought is oftentimes the barracks in which where Rebecca and the other women are creating this recipe book is the time in which they feel maybe the most safe in the camp. There might be Nazi guards walking through them, but oftentimes they're in their barracks when they're supposed to be sleeping, in which they're then able to maybe more freely uh, expose like show their emotions or feel that they can maybe reconnect with um, some of the feelings that they're having. So um, I think Alex and Rebecca have told us that it was of a way, and you can see in the letters to Herman, dreaming is a really big part of a lot of survivors and other even Holocaust victims who did say create art during the time when they are artists. A way of sustaining their practice, their skill, their humanity. And so I think that in this way, they're doing that, of course.
I think a lot of
Yeah.
times the students, when we work with students with this recipe book, they immediately get that desire to have something of your own, to not just to talk about these recipes, but to have them in something you can hold in your hand that you can hide. So the degree of permanence, I think, is as well is something important in that whole transaction is I may not be here tomorrow. I may be shot or killed, but I am leaving something,
Right, right. So there's a legacy
a
attached.
legacy, I think.
Yeah. Are those recipes available online?
They
They
are. I will remove. Can you see that? Whoops.
No.
Oh, I'm must have
Put it
stopped sharing.
into the chat, maybe. I don't know if you
I'll
have
put it in the
access.
chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on our website, we have a collections website that has both the original recipes in French and then the translation.
Okay, great. Do you have any knowledge of whether or not Rebecca had a relationship with, beyond just consumption, had a relationship with cooking or baking, or what her relationship with food was throughout her life?
Well, I think that's as a mother, as sort of the head of the family, in a sense, the one that was creating the family meals. Nothing professional, if that's what you're asking. She was,
Okay.
yeah,
So it was just
working,
being a wife, mother,
just being a
cooking for
wife,
her
mother.
family.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And I mean, that book was almost lost permanently, right? It was found on the bus, and What do you think that that means about survival through the Holocaust and for Holocaust education? Like it's really interesting that it was found and that it was, you know, that it was brought back, to the rightful owner and preserved. Don't I find that
Like so much
really
of survival
remarkable
during,
given the
yeah.
time. What do you think about that?
So much of survival during the Holocaust was luck. I mean, not the only factor, but in fluke and luck. I mean, the fact that she survived the bombing, that somebody found, it was actually the sack was found in a ravine. So it was outside of the bus in the elements in a ravine and in the countryside. And yet somebody found it and it happened to have enough identifying information that it could be traced to her. And the other thing, I think there were from the reports, there were a lot of recipe books created in camps. It was not an unusual phenomenon,
Oh, really?
but the fact that we only are aware of probably 6 to 10 still that actually survived the Holocaust shows you um, how rare the survival of it was of these books. So
Wow.
yeah.
And what do you think about this very small, quiet act of defiance and how we can interpret courage and bravery during the Holocaust? Because I'm sure you're familiar with so many stories. Like, what motivates somebody, I guess, to risk their lives for these small acts of defiance?
No, you go do that.
I think I'm not sure that this is a calculated risk that's taken. I think this is a spirit that's indomitable and it is so the fact that she is creating things to gift to other women and trying to give her love somewhere that caring the instinct not just to be taken care of and to have a but to be able to express that caretaking as she how many books were there altogether that she created 4 or 5 and for the purpose of gifting to other people. That's there's a need there that is that she is responding to, and I think that tells you a lot about the nature of women's survival. That caregiving aspect is as important as having food, as having shelter and warmth.
And the nurturing, like you said, of those around her.
Yeah.
Going back for a second to Rebecca's connection to cooking and food, and do you know after the war if she had a healthy relationship with food? Because so many survivors, developed eating disorders after the war. So do you have
I
any knowledge
Not that
of
I'm aware
anything?
of it. I wouldn't know. I didn't know her firsthand. What I know is through Alex, and he certainly never mentioned that food continued to be something really important in their house as a celebration. He talks about the orange cake and how much he loved it, and so I think not that I'm aware of. No.
How did this all end up? Maybe I missed it, but how did this all end up with Vancouver? If she came through Montreal, tell me that sort of origin of how you guys became involved in the Vancouver Holocaust
Well,
artifacts.
Alex Buckman, her son slash nephew, moved to Vancouver as a young man and
Okay.
got married, and he and his wife raised their sons here. He had grandchildren here, and became very involved in Holocaust education and the center here. He led our child survivors group for many years, and when he learned the story, he frequently visited his aunt. He would return to Montreal several times a year, and was had returned in 97 for one visit and happened to find the recipe book in a drawer and said to his aunt, "What's this? What are all these letters? What are?" And by then he had become involved in the Holocaust Education Center here and its educational mission. And he talked to her about donating them to our museum so that they could be used and displayed and shared the story shared with children. And she liked that idea. So that's how that came about.
What was her life like in Canada?
A very happy life. So they had Christian, their second biological child in Belgium, And when they moved to Montreal, they had a third child, Shirley, and then they had Alex, of course, so it was a family of 4 children, and they were happy and well adjusted. And but clearly this was an aspect of her life that she kept secret. Nobody knew about the recipe book until Alex found it. It was not something she spoke of. And as far as I understand, she did not speak very much about her experience in Ravensbrück during the Holocaust. It was a very she lost her dear brother Isaac, and Alex lost his parents. It was traumatizing. When the two couples decided to put their children into hiding with the Belgian resistance, they instructed that their names were changed, but they were treated as though they were siblings. They were, because they wanted the cousins, they were cousins, but they wanted them to stay together. They felt their chances of staying together would be greater if they were, purported to be siblings. And so the two families were very close. And so the loss of that couple was something devastating, not just for Alex as their child, but also for Rebecca. So I think clearly she dealt with a lot of pain in her life, and perhaps that was the reason why she kept the story secret for so long.
Is there anything about Rebecca's story that really resonates with the two of you personally?
I think the communal aspect, I think the quote that I while we were researching to create this presentation, the quote that I read from the Italian prisoner about how that Italian prisoner saw friendship being an act of defiance and resistance. I think, like Lise has laid out, the recipe book, the orange cake recipe, the sharing, I think it's something that as historians, we don't normally use, like, we're not writing huge papers about friendship or the topic of these kind of like anthropology, the social aspects of those, because they're hard to get hard evidence of. But testimony like this and recipe books, like we can start drawing with proper historical context, we can start drawing conclusions about how just central friendship and community is to women, especially during the Holocaust. So I think that's what resonates with me.
In this time of rising anti-Semitism globally, and yesterday, of course, being the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, what feels most urgent about sharing this story now and keeping the story alive?
Well, I think that we are in a very privileged position, Ellie and I, in the work that we do. In the last week, in the lead up to International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we have seen literally thousands of students, university administrators, politicians, teachers, the general public, who have all marked International Holocaust Remembrance Day and done so very sincerely. And it is through these stories, and we are so fortunate to have a group of survivors. And I lie awake at night worrying that we're running them too hard, but we can't stop them. They're insisting on getting out there, and but their stories are heard. These artifacts are something that children love to learn about. I can't tell you how excited they get when they come to the museum and see these artifacts. They're curious. They want to know the stories. They want to relate to the individuals behind them. And this is a bridge that we can create between communities. We're not going to solve anti-Semitism overnight.
No.
But I think that it's a very hopeful message that people are clamoring to us, like we're in such demand to mark Holocaust Remembrance Day, and to hear these stories, and to bring survivors to the schools. So maybe that's the most hopeful I can.
It's a good step forward, absolutely, and especially continuing to keep the stories alive and sharing them with audiences beyond our own, bubble and vacuum, right? We have to be able to educate not only the next generation, but non-Jews too about the Holocaust, because there's so many Holocaust deniers. Ladies, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share the story with us. It was really poignant and fascinating, and certainly demonstrates bravery and courage and defiance and qualities that, certainly illustrates empowered women during very challenging times. And on that note, I can segue nicely into some of our upcoming presentations that we have coming up on February 24th. Dr. Audrey Sasson is doing a presentation that is complimentary. It's a webinar on stress and anxiety. She Day, of course, we've launched across the country. She Day events are happening in cities including Vancouver and Calgary, London, Toronto, Montreal, and Delray Beach in Florida. And all of the activities will take place between March the 8th and the 12th. So we recommend that you visit our website at chw.ca to see whether there's an activity in your city and to purchase tickets and join us, because we are all about promoting empowered women and providing inspiration to our membership and to our donors and supporters. Lastly, Purim cards are available for sale, as well as Hamantashen only available in the Toronto area, but Purim cards available across the country. Ladies, thank you so much again for sharing the story with us, for being part of our International Holocaust Remembrance presentation. And thank you everybody for watching.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you for
Have a
having
nice
us.
day.
Bye-bye.